So this evening, we are going to talk about Lincoln's last breath. And we're going to retrace individuals that were actually there that night. There were women in the room, and we're going to be sharing their story. And the way we're going to do that is we are going to read their letters and see their friendship keepsakes that they kept from the Lincolns. And each item or even sentence that I say this evening is directly related to an item that I've found and can confirm. So let's go. Let's journey back 156 years. So tonight we're going to talk about Elizabeth Dixon on the left, who was my great-great-grandmother. On the right, circled as well, is her sister, Mary Kinney, and her niece, Constance Kinney. All three of them were summoned from their homes on Lafayette Square to come to the Petersen House. Now we know about the Petersen House and the experiences they had from letters that they wrote. And what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to just, the plan is to just take you through their lives, how they connected with the Lincolns, and then read those actual letters that both Elizabeth Dixon wrote, describing the horrific scene there, as well as Mary Lincoln's letter. She describes why these women were there and confirms their friendship. So let's go on this journey. So this is a close-up of Elizabeth Dixon, and that's actually a carte de visite that she had taken that the artist used for this painting. They had no TV or, sound recordings. This is the closest someone got to seeing the last hours of Lincoln's life. And it was created by an artist by the name of Alonzo Chappell and John Batchelor. Now, those women were related. As you can see up in the top is Elizabeth Dixon, a picture of her when she was getting married to James Dixon next to her. James Dixon was from Enfield, Connecticut. And he would walk by her house. She lived in East Hartford Hill, and they met and fell in love. And in 1840, they were married. Their parents, lower left below them, was Reverend Jonathan Cogswell, and his second wife is Jane Kirkpatrick. Over on the far right is sisters, Elizabeth Dixon's sisters, Mary Kinney on the end, and then Louisa and Annie. And I bring these people up because she wrote about them a lot in her diaries. She was very, very close to her family, her parents, as well as her sisters. Elizabeth and James Dixon had 4 children. We're going to talk mostly about their daughters, Bessie and Clemmy, because Clemmy was my great-grandmother. She was married to James Clark Welling. And then on the lower right is my grandfather, William Corcoran Welling, and his cousin, Marguerite Dixon Clark, and my great aunt Elsa. These people are the reason why we're here tonight, because if it wasn't for the daughters of the Dixons and these two cousins, Elsa and Marguerite, and of course, my grandfather had something to do with it too, we wouldn't be here. But the women in the family are the ones that really kept all the family possessions that allow us to be here tonight. Now, I mentioned that the Dixons, they were married in 1840, and they were able to take a European honeymoon. Elizabeth Dixon's, her great aunt was a woman by the name of Margaret Bayard Smith, and she was a tremendous writer, and I think she really inspired Elizabeth Dixon to keep diaries, and we have those today. We have the diary of Elizabeth Dixon. It's still unpublished. I've been working on it, and it's a marvelous look at Europe in 1840. The map on the bottom in the middle is where she traveled from England over to France, down over the Swiss Alps, down into Italy. And she recounts the year-and-a-half honeymoon. It's really a marvelous, just a snapshot of what it was like in 1840. She was accompanied by two companions, or they were. There was Leonard Woods. He was the president of Bowdoin College, and Mrs. Lydia Sigourney. She also accompanied them as they traveled. An individual that was a great influence of Elizabeth Dixon was Hannah More. She was an abolitionist. The first thing that Elizabeth Dixon, when she set foot in Bristol, England, was to find Hannah More's gravesite and the home she lived in. She wrote about that really eloquently. The woman on the left-hand side, I wonder if anybody recognizes her. That is a woman that was traveling through Europe when the Dixons were. Her name was Julia Gardner. She would become Julia Tyler, First Lady of the wife of John Tyler. But at this time, she was Miss Gardner, and she was a beauty. She was, legendary. And you see a picture there above her portrait, and it's a letter that she wrote. When they were in Europe, they met the King of France, and Julia Gardner wrote this in a letter to Elizabeth Dixon. Let's see. She said, "Do you remember our introduction to the court of the Tuileries and your apprehension of the king? You didn't mind the queen, but when the king appeared, poor old Louis Philippe with his soiled court dress and tawdry looking wig accidentally on one side. Oh, it's so much. And he was so much shorter than he appeared in the pictures. How disappointed you were." So Julia was saying that about Elizabeth Dixon, because they would recount things when they come back to their rooms, and they had a very close friendship. Now, I mentioned that Elizabeth Dixon kept diaries. James Dixon was elected to the House of Representatives in 1845, and she described in her diary her life, her experiences when she went to Washington, 1845 to 1847. And that diary I transcribed, and White House History published it. And you can read it yourself. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about a couple of the things that she said in it. One was the fact that when she arrived in Washington, she stayed at the Arts Club of Washington, the Monroe House. And she describes it in her diary. and you can read about it as well. But I'll just describe what she thought about. 2017, I Street, Northwest, Washington. So we left the next morning at 9 for Washington, arrived at 11:30, and we reached our home for the winter. We were met at the door and waited upon into the parlor. It has a piano and guitar and comfortably and nicely furnished. All the curtains are a deep snuff color. There are 2 couches, a sofa, center table, and crimson velvet rocking chair. And then I went upstairs to my room and I found a large French bedstead of maple and large chintz sofa and pillows, and a wardrobe and a washstand, and dressing bureaus and rocking chair and center table. And the curtains were blue watered but dingy muslin. The beds were clean and new and comfortable. And the nursery opens from my room and has an airtight stove and is very well. She also mentioned that at the house there were 7 slaves in the family, and Richard waits upon us, and Winnie is the chambermaid. As I said earlier, that Margaret Baird Smith was an aunt of hers, and she was a great influence. I see it in her writing. Even though Margaret Baird Smith had died in 1843, she was an influence when Elizabeth Dixon was a teenager. Dolly Madison, though, she describes in the diary, and she became quite close to her. Elizabeth Dixon brought 2 toddler daughters with her, along with her sister, Annie, and a nurse. She was 7 months pregnant when she arrived, and she delivered her son, James Willis Dixon, while she's there, describes that. As for Dolly Madison, she was the queen of Washington, and this is the way she described her. Oh, she is certainly one of the most remarkable women of her age I've ever seen, or of any age, perhaps. Her complexion is as delicate as a rose, and with a fullness of face which entirely precludes every appearance of old age. Her height is medium, but she is so dignified and graceful in her carriage that she is a model of elegance. So in the diary, Elizabeth Dixon describes so many of the movers and shakers of that time period. Now, the Lincolns were there for the 30th Congress. Elizabeth Dixon wrote about the 29th, but Congressman, or the House of Representatives, James Dixon was there, and he overlapped with Lincoln. Although we don't know if the Lincoln or Elizabeth Dixon ever met Mary Lincoln during those seasons. And I will remind. But certainly Abraham Lincoln knew James Dixon, because he wrote his friend William Herndon, if you wish to wish a full understanding of the war, the whole and or nearly so, is to be found in the speech of Dixon of Connecticut. So he, right there, that was an indication that he was aware of Dixon. But when they arrived in Washington, Mary Lincoln, James Dixon was there when Lincoln got elected in 1861. He remained there through the Civil War and left in 1869. You see here, Senator Dixon was an anti-slavery statesman. And yes, indeed, he said aye to the 13th Amendment. So when Mary Lincoln came to Washington, the first invitation that was waiting for her was from Senator Foote. And he invited her over on the left-hand side. Written left-hand side, you can see the invitation sent to Mary Lincoln. And it is inviting her to be escorted to the Capitol by none other than Senator Dixon and Senator Hale. Senator Hale's daughter was turned out she was a girlfriend of John Wilkes Booth. So oddly enough, both the Dixons and the Hales had something to do with the night Lincoln died. Down below the Union Ball invitation is Bessie on the left and Clemmy on the right. Also, the other two children of the Dixons is Jamie in the soldier's uniform, and below him, Henry Whitfield Dixon. So the ladies, they attended the inaugural ball in 1861, and just a short time later, in July, you see over on the right-hand side, that is a letter from Winfield Scott allowing Senator Dixon to cross over the lines. That date is the very first battle of the Civil War, the Battle of Bull Run, which Senator Dixon witnessed. Now, I have a friend going to help me out here, Dwane. Elizabeth Dixon really loved to collect autographs. That was a hobby of hers. So that's one of the really fascinating things about her. Not only did she write diaries and tremendous lots of letters, she wrote letters to people and asked them for their signature. And this is just an indication of one of those letters that she received back. Dwane, could you help me out here?
Certainly. Cambridge, March 3rd, 1867. My dear Mrs. Dixon, I feel this morning like a man convicted of a crime, for I have found among other unanswered letters yours, whose date I will not mention, hoping that you may have forgotten it. I will not by it excuse myself, but say only that when I made the discovery, my sensations were like that which Dante describes as running over him when he saw Virgil was angry with him. And as he is who dreams all his own harm, who dreaming wishes it may be a dream, so that he erase what is as if it were not, such I became, and having not power to speak, for to excuse myself I wished, and still excuse myself, and did not think I did it. Next time I will try to remember how much easier and better it is to do things at once, before delay has taken all grace out of the action. I enclose the autograph with great pleasure and remain yours very truly, Henry W. Longfellow.
Thank you so much. Yes, she wrote and got autographs from all the rock stars of the time. Now, Elizabeth Dixon's daughters, Clemmy and Bessie, they had worked in the hospitals in Armory Square. And Mary Lincoln was a frequent visitor to the hospitals. It was almost as though after her son died, it was very, it was a part of her mourning. She visited them all the time and brought flowers and treats for them and wrote letters for them. And this is a letter that Elizabeth Dixon received from Mrs. Lincoln saying, please accept this simple bouquet for yourself and ladies. And I'm happy to let you think that my little boy is recovering, but I've been deeply affected in that the least sickness unnerves me, and I'll be ready to accompany you any day to the hospitals when it is pleasant. Very sincerely, Mary Lincoln. On the bottom, that is the envelope is Mary Lincoln's. She scratched out the address and then wrote over the corrected one. They changed the names from Corcoran's Row to President Square. These are just various things that the Dixons had an invitation to the White or the President's house Monday, February 13th, which was the day after Lincoln's birthday. And also above it is, or to the right in the middle, is a telegram that Senator Dixon received from Lincoln. And very short and sweet, very Lincoln-esque. Come here, he wrote, A. Lincoln. And below it, will Senator Dixon please call on me in the morning? And that was A. Lincoln. As well as senators, they assisted the president with making appointments in their state. And this was a list gathered by Abraham Lincoln, and assumed that Senator Dixon was helping him with it because it ended up, they exchanged it. And then below it, that is the funeral pass to Abraham Lincoln's funeral, which Elizabeth Dixon did carry. She did not attend the funeral, though. She was upstairs with Mary Lincoln. Now, I mentioned that my great-grandfather was James Clark Welling. During this time, he was the editor of the National Intelligencer newspaper. And on August 22nd, 1862, President Lincoln, he finished a letter that he was writing in response to Horace Greeley, the New York Tribune editor, who had recently written an public editorial to Lincoln, which Lincoln was responding to. But President Lincoln decided not to send it to Greeley, but instead to a rival editor, to James Clark Welling, my great-grandfather. This letter has gone down in history as one of the most, let me just read to you what Philip Shaw Paladin, he wrote that if there's any document that is more often quoted than any other in the argument, debate, and conversation about Lincoln, it's the letter that Lincoln wrote August 22nd, 1862 to Horace Greeley. It may be misunderstood, but it is a masterpiece. Within the letter, we find my paramount object in this struggle is to save or destroy the Union. But the very last line of it is why I believe it's such an exceptional document, is that he writes that he states that there's no modification to my personal view that all men everywhere should be free. Abraham Lincoln. And below the letter, towards the left, is Nicolay, John Nicolay. And I discovered that he recalled this that when Lincoln brought the letter over to Welling did something very brazen that a young editor really was surprised that he did this. That Welling asked Lincoln to take out a sentence: "Broken eggs can never be mended," the whole sentence, and Lincoln obliged him. But Lincoln used that sentence later. He still liked it, but it might not be good enough for the National Intelligencer, but it sure was good enough for him in a later letter. But it's a masterful letter, and I believe it's a masterpiece, an American treasure. So much so, James Welling believed that as too. He kept the original, and it remained in our family. And during COVID, I took it upon myself, and I made some archival prints of it. And it's a beautiful document. And if you would like copies of it, there's my website, thegreeleyletter.com, because unfortunately my family did donate it to the oldest art museum in the country, where it's in a safe inside of a vault and really doesn't see the light of day. So it's your chance to own a little bit of American history. Some of the things that that were left, Elizabeth Dixon used the night that Lincoln died. Presumably, this is the dress. It's a mourning dress owned by Elizabeth Dixon. It's right behind me, and there is her Bible there, and that she quite most likely brought with her to the Petersen House. And Senator Dixon's pocket watch and Elizabeth Dixon's pocket watch. And her pocket watch is on the bottom, and see that where it's set or stopped at 7:22, the exact time that Lincoln died. Now, where did the Dixons live during the Civil War? Well, they lived right on Lafayette Square. Thanks to John O'Brien's map, he helped me discover where 28 President Square is, or 28 Lafayette Square. It's right around the corner from the Seward, William Seward's home. This is Lincoln and Washington map. It was created by John O'Brien, who was the president of the Lincoln Group of DC, or just past present, going out, moving to Colorado happily. And but this map is such a contribution to the study of Lincoln and Washington, D.C. It's just such a fabulous document. It's behind me. I have it on the wall. And so Elizabeth Dixon lived right in that White House, just a stone's throw from William Seward. And I find it quite remarkable, the fact that William Seward house was he was attacked by one of the conspirators, and no one heard it around the corner. But who am I? All I know is what is written down by Elizabeth Dixon. So now we're going over to the actual recounting of what happened the night Lincoln died. And you are going to hear a letter written by Elizabeth Dixon to her sister Louisa. She's describing the night that Lincoln died. It also is followed by, I put on the tail end of the letter to Louisa, a letter that she wrote a year later to O.C. Marsh. And it poignantly tells us a little bit more about why the world knows so little about Elizabeth Dixon. May 1865, Hartford. My dear Louisa, on Good Friday, I'd been at church all morning and passed the rest of the day at the hospital. We all came home very tired and went to bed at 9:30. Bessie and Clemmy have wards in the hospital, and Jamie is in the army, and one of his school friends is here taking care of us. I'd been asleep when a carriage driving violently up to the door and stopping awakened me. The man answered, "A message from Captain Robert Lincoln for Mrs. Dixon. The President is dead, and Captain Robert Lincoln wishes you to come to Mrs. Lincoln as quickly as possible." Of course, I thought that the President had died at the White House, and knowing my familiarity with sickness and death, they had sent for me. So I hastened to dress and sent for Mrs. Kinney, and we set off. The man said that the President was murdered at the theater, taken to the house opposite 10th Street. So we drove there and found it already guarded by a regiment of cavalry. In the back room, over a back building, on a common bedstead, covered with an army blanket and a colored woolen coverlet, lay stretched the murdered President, his life's blood slowly ebbing away. The officers of the government were there, and no lady except Miss Harris, whose dress was splattered with blood, as was Mrs. Lincoln's, who was just frantic with grief beside him, calling on him to take her with him, to speak one word to her. But her agonizing appeals were to no avail. I held her and supported her as well as I could, and twice we persuaded her to go into another room. All night long we watched this way, from 11:30 to 7 the next morning. At that hour, just as the day was struggling with the dim candles in the room, we went in again. And Mrs. Lincoln must have noticed a change, for the moment that she looked at him, she fainted upon the floor. I caught her in my arms and held her to the window, which was open and the rain falling heavily. She again seated herself by the President and kissing him and calling him every endearing name. The surgeons counting every pulsation and noting every breath gradually growing less and less. And they asked her to go into the adjoining room, and 20 minutes came in and said, "It is all over. The President is no more." At 9 o'clock, we took her home to that house so changed for her, and the doctor said she must go immediately to bed. She refused to go into any of the rooms she had previously occupied. "No, not there. No, not there," she said. And we took her to a room she had arranged for the President, for a summer room to write in. And I remained until 11 o'clock, 12 hours from the time I went to her, and then left her a lonely widow. Everything changed for her since they had left it so happily the evening previous. As I started to go down the stairs, I met the cortege bringing up the remains of the murdered President, which were taken into the great state bedroom, wrapped in the American flag. Oh, the paths of glory, they lead but to the grave. When I went to the house in 10th Street, the carriage returned, and Mary and Constance came down and watched with Mrs. Lincoln, and we have been with her frequently since. She's unable to leave her bed, of course, and cannot immediately leave the White House. It was such a scene of desolation and horror. Truly, I've forbidden artists from putting me into the picture representing the death of the president. I was so haunted by it and so nervous that I could not wish the association perpetuated, and I thought that it would be very unpleasant to see such a picture advertised or on exhibition. Oh, the newspaper reporters have a way of putting everything into the papers. And I told one of them that I would pay him if he ever saw our names going into the paper to keep them out. So, I have to tape record that because it's too upsetting for me. I'm afraid I'm going to break into tears, and I have. And it's every time I hear it, it's so heart-wrenching. So, the next letter you will hear is from Mary Lincoln, written to Elizabeth Dixon 6 months later, after they witnessed the tragedy together. October 13th, 1865, Chicago. My dear Mrs. Dixon, notwithstanding weeks have passed since your last kind letter was received, yet my saddened memory often recalls you to mind, and your gentleness and tender sympathy. It can never be forgotten. In the middle of my grief on that terrible night, which has left me so desolate and broken-hearted, it has often struck me as strange, yet not so, that even whilst I was so wild in my despair, when Robert said to me, "Mother, what ladies shall I go for?" I immediately exclaimed, "Mrs. Dixon and Mrs. Kinney." Oh, the scenes we then passed through are continually present with me, and will ever bow my head in sorrow and vain regret. Oh, my dear Mrs. Dixon, how painful and harrowing is the thought that when my eldest son most required his father's counsels and guidance, he's deprived of them. Oh, the remembrance of your lovely patriotic daughters often comes before me, so different from the young ladies of wealth and position here, who think of nothing but pleasure. I presume you will very soon think about returning to Washington. Will Miss and Mrs. Kinney be there this winter? Oh, I am indebted to dear Mrs. Kinney for her very sweet and charming letter. If I knew her whereabouts, I should reply to it. I've been desiring for some time past, my dear Mrs. Dixon, to be able to get into some boxes deposited in a remote warehouse, as I wish to send your husband and yourself some little relics that once were his, my husband's. I'm sure they would be valued by you as such. Robert says that until we get into a house, as we are still boarding, I cannot approach the boxes. And this is quite a trial, I assure you. If ever the time comes, which I trust it certainly will be here before long, you will be remembered. Your husband was so highly esteemed by the president. How much reason I have had to love you. Oh, dearly, I should like to see you all and see. I trust someday it will be differently situated from present. Oh, with regards to your family, I remain always truly, Mary Lincoln. Whoops. Wow. Well, afterward, Elizabeth Dixon's health was, all I know is it wasn't good. You could tell by the letter that she wrote a year later that she was really traumatized by it. It made her real nervous. And they were in Rome, and I guess she got sick there, and was sick for a long time before she died. So let's see what happened afterward. After all this, well, Mary Kinney's children went on to do some wonderful things. Ernest Kinney, he was in the Civil War, and in I think it was 1870, he married Louise Catlin, who was the daughter of the famed painter George Catlin. Did all those wonderful paintings of the Indians. Well, Constance Kinney, she became actually a countess, and she married Count Giannotti of Italy and lived in Colonna Palace in Rome. And Francis Stillwell Kinney, he and his brothers owned Kinney Tobacco Company, later the American Tobacco Company, and built a community in Kinnelon, New Jersey. And Abbott Kinney, he was the original California dreamer. And Abbott Kinney developed Venice of America, and now Venice, California. And Elizabeth Dixon's family, well, my grandfather's up on the top right, and in the middle is Jamie's family. So Elizabeth Dixon had 12 grandchildren. My grandfather, Aunt Elsa, and then Jamie's 10 children. They were very close cousins, very, very close. In fact, Marguerite on the bottom right was in, I think, both my grandfather's wedding, William Corcoran's wedding, and her brother, Francis Stillwell Dixon, was his best man when he married Rosalie Hooker. Now, the problem was that Rosalie Hooker fell in love with Francis Stillwell Dixon, the best man, at my grandfather's wedding. And that marriage didn't work out. So she sued him for divorce, and she lost. But she ended up getting a divorce anyway to marry Francis Stillwell Dixon. And it's a happy story in the end, because my grandfather married the wonderful Muriel May Wingo, my grandmother. And Francis Stillwell Dixon did marry Rosalie, and Rosalie's grandson and I, are Kent, are great friends. We both live in Ohio. And another really important member of the family was Marguerite Dixon Clark. She was close with my Aunt Elsa and her aunts, and she married the infamous one and only Henry Austin Clark Sr. And his son went on to be an automotive authority. Henry Austin Clark Jr. is very well known and in the world of antique cars, and his huge collection is now at the Ford in Michigan. Thankfully, Marguerite's granddaughter and I were able to we met, and she provided a lot of these wonderful relics that were part of the family collection. And which brings me to the last two children of the Dixons. There was Henry and Bessie. And Bessie was the matriarch of the family after Elizabeth Dixon died. She lived in the big old estate now where the Aetna Insurance Agency, Aetna Insurance home office is, on Asylum Hill in Hartford. And she legally adopted my Aunt Elsa. When she died at 101 years old, Aunt Elsa got the whole estate of the Dixons and the Wellings. And Elsa's dying concern was about her family's belongings and their care, and that really haunted me because it's such a treasure trove of things. So something that I never knew, and I was the first in the family to discover this. No one ever knew, other than the name Henry Whitfield Dixon, the youngest child of Elizabeth Dixon. This was the family skeleton in the attic. He suffered mental illness and was committed to a sanitarium in Litchfield, Connecticut, when he was about 30, and then soon after, he tried to escape, and some individuals took advantage of him, and he lost all of his inheritance. And he did spend the rest of his life in Dr. Coombs' asylum in Flushing, Long Island. But the happy ending is the great-grandchildren of Elizabeth Dixon have returned to visit the Arts Club of Washington. We were there in 2017, and John O'Brien was able to give us a wonderful tour. We just stood in the lobby of the house, but he had some wonderful tidbits of information, and took us around to different spots where the Dixons and the Lincolns were during the Civil War. And we ended up heading over to Ford's Theater, of course, and that is the big broadside advertising those individuals that signed the 13th Amendment. So I want to thank you all for joining me tonight as we honor the life and legacy of President Abraham Lincoln and all those who supported him during his life, and those who continue to carry on his belief today that all men and women everywhere should be free.
Well, thank you very much, Caroline. That was sensational. I really learned so much, and I've actually reviewed this many times, but she comes up with something new all the time there. So a little bit different than the average family heirlooms and so forth. Do you have any questions that we can answer for you? You can either use the chat function, or you can turn on your video and wave, and we'll respond to you in kind. Okay, while we're waiting, a real quick question was, obviously the music that started this whole show was Lincoln's 2 Cents by your brother, Will. That's correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And is he a professional musician or what?
Well, he's retired now, but he has been a musician all of his life, ever since he was probably 5 years old. And yeah, he loves rocks too. He's a geologist, and he wrote that tune in 2015 for the anniversary of the 150-year anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. And we were all there at Ford's Theater in Anonymous at the Petersen House exactly at 11 o'clock when she came there. And it was the Ford's Theater, the Park Service, and the National Portrait Gallery put on some wonderful events during the 150-year anniversary of Lincoln's death. And we were there. It just, anonymous, and thankful that our great-great-grandmother was there to support Elizabeth Dixon, holding her up to that window. Because nobody, I mean, it's tough. It was a tough job to do that night.
I'll bet it was. We have a question. What happened to James Clark Welling?
Yep. James Clark Welling. Thanks, Steve. I bet you asked that one. James Clark Welling became the 6th president of George Washington University. And he really made a wonderful contribution to the city of Washington. Some of the organizations that he helped found were the National Geographic Society. He worked as a regent for the Smithsonian many years. Corcoran Art Gallery. He was very involved with that. In fact, my grandfather's middle name is Corcoran. Also, the Cosmos Club, the Copyright League of Washington, and the Columbia Historical Society, which is now the DC Historical Society, to name a few. We're proud of him.
A question again was dealing with all the items that you came up with. Where are they housed now specifically?
Well, they're with me right now, but tomorrow they'll be in the safe deposit box.
All right.
And I'm going to be, if anybody has any suggestions of repositories where such a collection should be donated to, I'm all ears. You can contact me.
There was a question from Bill Turner about Elizabeth Dixon and Walt Whitman. Did they meet since they were both in Washington, D.C. at the same time during the Civil War? Do you have any indication of that?
Yep, great question. Well, you know that Walt Whitman frequented the Armory Square Hospital, but he didn't like write down remembering meeting her, or Elizabeth Dixon didn't, but there were other nurses there, Mrs. Ingram, I think specifically, that didn't like him. And I really don't think that Elizabeth Dixon would have had a problem with him. In fact, she would have seen that he was helping those soldiers. And that's really what was so fabulous about his involvement. Those soldiers really benefited from him. But I'm sure they knew each other.
Speaking of the Armory Square, which Armory Square would not be too far from where the pension building was located, over near F Street and 6th on that basis. Someone, and I didn't catch the name, John Leal, was at the Armory Hospital, and he was also in attendance at the deathbed.
Yes. Right, correct. But Dr. Bliss was the one, I believe, that was the main doctor at Armory Square that I've seen writings about.
Leo ran the commissioned officers ward, and Bliss ran the hospital.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, John.
I lecture on Dr. Leo.
Thank you. He must have been the one that gave the little bit of a lock of hair to the family member. It was a Todd that gave the lock of hair to Elizabeth Dixon. But I would imagine Leo was the one that gave it to him.
Leo ended up holding Lincoln's hand for 9 hours in the Petersen House. Just in case he might wake up, he said.
Oh. So is the text of Elizabeth Dixon's letter available to the public? Well, yeah. What happened was the letter, the first one that I read, was published in the New York Times because a collector, Mary Benjamin, found it, or someone brought it in. A friend of Louisa's had it in a scrapbook and she wanted to sell it. But thankfully, Mary Benjamin, she published it in the New York Times, so we could read the text, but it's in a private collection still. But yeah, it's accessible online, certainly.
Someone just asked us the relationship between Robert Todd Lincoln and Mrs. Dixon before and after Lincoln's death.
There wasn't any that I know of. No, there's no documentation. So sadly.
All right. All right. Anyone else? Well, we've been going.
Just to finish up, Armory Square is where the Air and Space Museum is now.
So it's further south of where I was
Seventh and Independence.
Okay, I was too far north.
There was an armory there.
All right. Okay, anyone else?
Yep.
Did Mrs. Dixon know about Myra Bradwell, who helped?
Leave the asylum. Okay.
Yes.
She was dead by then. Elizabeth Dixon died in 1871, and that was 1885, I believe. So yeah, I'm sorry. I mean, Elizabeth Dixon died early, young. And so did Mary Kinney. But it was the same year that her son had escaped from an asylum. So they were having their own problems. Now, did you know if you are committed to an institution, your property cannot legally be sold? So I think was the reason why some families committed their family members, because they wanted to make sure that they didn't get taken advantage of. However, it happened to Harry. He lost all of his money. Someone took it. Yeah.
Okay, I see that Sasha is sort of stirring there.
Hi there. So if there are no other questions, we'd like to invite everybody to come off and of their muted audio, video and turn your cameras on so we can see all your lovely faces and say thank you for joining us this evening for this really fantastic presentation. And thanks again for coming out to the Arts Club of Washington event, Lincoln's Last Breath. I learned a lot of new things tonight. And also, if you love these kind of things, I will put Caroline's social media contacts in if you want to contact her and later on. And also, if you are interested in other events at the Arts Club, I'd like to invite you to go to our website, artsclubofwashington.org, and sign up for the newsletter, because we have a weekly newsletter that tells you all the new events that are coming out. A lot of them are free and open to the public if you're not a member, or if you're interested in membership, find out how. So that's my little, advocacy for the club tonight. So I just want to say thank you. And as we like to say before we leave, that's a wrap. And have a really safe and wonderful evening. And thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Dwane.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.